He came through the gate at Stillwater with his hand on another man's shoulder instead of the reins, and Clara Doyle's heart broke and mended itself in the same instant, before she had even reached the yard. She had waited 3 years for this. She had told herself, through every long winter and every letter that came fewer and further between, that she would know Ezra Cole anywhere, in any condition, and she found now that it was true. She knew the set of his jaw, the way he still stood too straight out of old habit, the particular tilt of his head when he was listening hard for something. What she had not known, what no letter had prepared her for, was the strip of dark cloth tied across his eyes, or the careful, testing way he lifted each boot before he set it down, like a man walking on ice he could not see. She remembered the last morning she had seen him whole, 3 years gone now, standing at this very gate with his enlistment papers folded in his coat pocket, and his eyes brown, quick, unbearably alive, fixed on her, as though he meant to carry the sight of her clear across the war and back. He had promised her that morning that he would come home and marry her properly, in the little Stillwater church, with her mother's lace veil if her mother would part with it. And Clara had promised right back that she'd be there waiting no matter how long it took. Neither of them had imagined what shape that promise might have to bend itself around before it was through. Ezra? She was running before she knew she meant to, skirts caught up in both fists, and she did not stop until she had both his hands in hers, work-roughened hands she remembered as smooth around a plow handle 3 years before. "Ezra, it's Clara. I'm here." He went very still. The soldier walking beside him, a corporal who'd escorted him the last leg from the depot, and who touched his hat to Clara with the particular gentleness of a man delivering hard cargo, stepped back to give them room. "Clara," Ezra said her name like a man testing whether the ground beneath it would hold. "You shouldn't have come out. I wrote you not to trouble yourself meeting the train." "I wasn't meeting a train. I was meeting you." She held his hands tighter, felt them tremble, and understood in that moment that the tremor was not weakness but shame, a man's whole pride collapsing in on itself in the space between the depot road and his own front gate. "Come inside. I've got supper on, and Mrs. Aldous helped me air out your room proper, and—" "Clara," he pulled his hands free of hers, gently but with a finality that stopped her cold. "I need you to hear me plain, because I mean to say it only the once. I'm blind. Not half blind, not going to mend with time, blind, full and forever. The surgeon in Washington said as much before he ever put me on the train home. I'm no use to a farm or a wife or anybody, and I'll not have you tie yourself to a man who can't so much as find his own barn door without a rope strung to guide him. You're released from anything you ever promised me. I want you to go home to your father's place and forget you ever waited on a fool who went off to war and came back less than half of what he left as." The yard went silent, but for the wind moving through the cottonwoods and a hen somewhere fussing over nothing. Clara looked at this man she had loved since she was 17 years old, standing rigid and blind, and trying with his whole broken heart to give her away for her own good, and felt something in her go hard and certain, the way iron goes hard when it's quenched. "No," she said. Ezra's jaw tightened. "Clara." "No," she said again, quieter this time but no less final. "I didn't wait 3 years on a promise so I could break it the first hard morning it asked something of me. You can tell me to go 100 times, Ezra Cole, and I'll tell you no 101. Now come inside. Supper's getting cold, and I won't stand out here arguing with a stubborn man in front of God and this poor corporal who's had a long enough journey without watching us quarrel besides." The corporal, to his credit, kept his eyes carefully on the middle distance and said nothing at all. Ezra did not move for a long moment, his unseeing eyes fixed on some point past her shoulder, some point that might have been the war or might have been the ruin of every plan he'd carried home in his kit. Then, slowly, stiffly, as though the fight had gone out of him for the moment, though Clara did not for one instant believe it was gone for good, he let her take his arm and lead him up the path to the house his father had built and he himself had meant to fill with a family. She got him fed, got him settled, and did not let herself cry until she was alone in the kitchen scraping plates, and even then only for as long as it took to dry her eyes and square her shoulders, and remind herself that a woman who had buried her own mother at 16 and kept her father's house alone for years after had faced harder mornings than this one, and come through them standing. Stillwater, when Clara had last seen it whole, had been Ezra's father's pride, 300 acres of good bottomland along the creek, a solid house, a barn that didn't leak, fences that held. 3 years of a young man's absence, an old man's failing health, and finally the elder Cole's death the previous winter had let it all slide into the kind of disrepair that crept in quietly, and then all at once. The hired man Ezra's father had kept on had drifted off after the funeral, unpaid and unthanked, and the neighbor who'd promised to look in on things had looked in rather less than promised. Clara had been coming by twice a week all that spring to do what she could: mend a fence here, see to the few remaining cattle there. But it was a woman's stopgap, not a farm's salvation, and she knew it. She knew, too, within her first week of trying to care for Ezra in that house, that his blindness was the smaller of his two wounds. The larger one did not show on his face at all. "You needn't fuss over the wood box," he told her flatly on the third morning, when she came in from splitting kindling to find him sitting rigid at the table, his untouched coffee gone cold. "I can manage." "I know you can," Clara said, setting the wood down. "I split it because my hands were free and yours were busy drinking coffee, which I notice you haven't done." "I don't need managing, Clara. I need you to stop pretending there's a life left here worth managing." His voice cracked on the last word, just barely, just enough for her to hear the whole raw wound beneath the pride. "I can't see my own hand. I can't ride the fence line. I can't tell one bill from another without help, can't shoot a rattler out of the yard, can't do half of what a man's supposed to do to keep a place like this standing. Every day you stay, you're only making it harder on both of us when you finally see sense and go." "I've had a good deal of time to consider sense, Ezra, sitting home 3 years wondering if you'd come back to me at all," Clara said, and she did not raise her voice, because she had learned long ago that a raised voice only gave a stubborn man something to push against. "I decided a long while back that the sensible thing was to love you regardless of what state you came home in. I haven't changed my mind, and I don't intend to, no matter how many mornings you sit there hoping to talk me out of it over cold coffee." He said nothing to that, only turned his blind face toward the window as though he could still see the fields beyond it, and Clara went back out to the woodpile with her throat tight and her resolve, if anything, harder than before. It was not only Ezra's pride she had to fight. Within the fortnight, a man named Silas Grimes came riding out from the county seat with papers in his saddlebag and an offer on his tongue, dressed up in sympathy, but plain enough underneath. He'd heard the coal place had fallen on hard times, heard the young owner had come home unable to work it, and he'd be glad to take the burden off a suffering family's hands at a fair price, cash on the spot, no need for anyone to trouble themselves further. Clara met him at the gate before he'd gotten 3 sentences into his pitch to Ezra on the porch. "Mr. Grimes," she said, pleasant as poison, "Stillwater isn't for sale, and I'll thank you to take your fair price back to town with you." "Now, miss, this isn't rightly your decision, too." "It's rightly Mr. Cole's decision," Clara said, "and I expect you'll find he hasn't the smallest interest in selling to a man who rode 30 miles the moment he heard a wounded soldier might be too discouraged to say no." She held Grimes's gaze until the man's oily confidence flickered, just slightly, and then she watched him gather his papers and go, and did not miss the way Ezra's jaw had tightened through the whole exchange, listening to a stranger discuss the disposal of his birthright like a parcel of goods. "You shouldn't have sent him off on my account," Ezra said afterward, though there was less conviction in it than there had been a week before. "Might be he's right. Might be I can't hold this place regardless of who stays to help me." "Might be," Clara agreed, sitting down across from him at the table. "Or might be a man who can't see with his eyes could still learn to run a place by feel and memory and good hired help, if he had a mind to try instead of a mind to quit. I've seen you angry these 2 weeks, Ezra Cole, and I've seen you ashamed, and I've seen you sorry for yourself, which I'll grant you've earned some right to be. What I haven't seen yet is you try. And until I see you try and fail, I'll not believe a word you say about what you can't do." It was the first time since he'd come home that something other than despair moved across his face, something that might, in a better week, have grown into anger, or pride, or even hope. For now it was only a flicker, gone as quick as it came, but Clara held onto the memory of it like a coal banked for later warmth. The county doctor, an old, kindly man named Fenwick who had delivered half of Stillwater's children and buried the other half's grandparents, rode out that same week at Clara's asking, though she suspected even before he arrived that he would have little comfort to offer. He examined Ezra's eyes by lamplight for the better part of an hour, asked careful questions about the shell that had gone off too close, and finally sat back with the particular gentleness doctors reserve for news they wish they didn't have to give. "There's no mending it, son," Fenwick said. "The nerve's destroyed clean through. I've seen it before in the ones who came back from the worst of the shelling, and I'll not lie to you and call it anything but permanent." He paused, glanced at Clara, and added, with more warmth than the diagnosis itself, "But I'll tell you what I've also seen, which is men who built whole full lives around a wound like this, and men who let the wound bury them instead. Which one you turn out to be isn't a matter of your eyes at all, Ezra. Never was." Ezra said nothing for a long while after the doctor rode off, sitting with his blind face turned toward the window as though sheer will might yet conjure back some sliver of the daylight he could no longer see. It was Clara who finally broke the silence, quietly, not pushing, simply present. "Dr. Fenwick's known you since you were a boy climbing his fence to steal his apples. I don't expect he'd tell you a comfortable lie just to spare your feelings." "No," Ezra admitted. "He never was one for comfortable lies." And something in the flatness of his voice that day was, Clara thought afterward, very slightly less like despair and very slightly more like a man beginning, however unwillingly, to reckon with a truth instead of merely drowning in it. She hired back the old hand, a patient, taciturn man named Gil Rourke who'd worked for Ezra's father a decade, and asked no wages beyond what the place could presently spare. And between the two of them, they began, slowly, to coax Stillwater back from the edge of ruin. Clara kept the accounts, since numbers could be read aloud, and Ezra's memory for figures proved sharper than his pride would ever admit. She walked the fence lines with him on quiet mornings, describing each break and lean until he could picture it plain enough to direct the mending. And though he fought her at every turn in those early weeks, muttering that a farm run by a blind man's guesswork and a woman's charity was no farm at all, he came, bit by grudging bit, to the fence in the mornings without her having to ask twice. The harder fight was the one no ledger could measure. Ezra woke some nights shouting words Clara had never heard him say before the war, words about fire and noise and men's names she didn't know. And she learned to sit beside his bed in the dark without lighting the lamp, her hand on his shoulder, saying nothing until his breathing settled, because she had learned early that comfort offered too loud only frightened him further into the dark place he'd come home carrying. On the mornings after those nights, he was hardest on her, sharpest with his words, quickest to tell her again that she ought to go. And Clara understood well enough that his cruelty in those hours was aimed less at her than at the war itself, which had left him no other target close enough to strike. "I dreamed I couldn't find my way out of the trench," he told her once in the gray hour before dawn, his voice stripped of all its daytime armor. "Woke up, and for a minute I thought I still couldn't see because of the smoke. Then I remembered." He laughed, a short, terrible sound with no humor in it at all. "Then I remembered it isn't smoke. It's just how things are now forever, and there's no waiting it out." "There's no waiting it out," Clara agreed softly. "But there's living through it, which isn't the same thing as waiting, Ezra. A man can live a whole rich life through a thing he can't wait out. My own mother lived 11 years past the doctor's certainty she wouldn't see another Christmas, and she filled every one of those years with more living than most whole, healthy folks manage in twice the time." "Your mother wasn't blind." "No," Clara said. "She was dying, which I'd reckon is a good deal harder to live around than blindness, and she managed it with more grace than either of us has managed anything these 3 weeks. I'm only saying it can be done, Ezra. Not easily, but it can be done, and I mean to be here doing it alongside you whether you like the notion or not." He did not answer that, but he did not tell her to leave again that morning, which Clara counted, in the private ledger she kept of small victories, as worth a great deal more than it might have seemed to anyone watching from outside. Silas Grimes came back once more before the leaves turned, this time with a different tack, calling on Clara alone at the mercantile in town, and suggesting, in a voice greased with false concern, that a young woman ought to think of her own future before she tied it permanently to a blind man's ruin, that there were whole men enough in the county who'd be glad of a wife with her sense and her steadiness, and that he only meant it kindly, being a friend to the family. Clara set down her basket, looked him full in the face, and told him that she had already thought of her own future with more care than he supposed, and that her future had Ezra Cole in the whole of it, blind or whole, and that if he meant to keep circling Stillwater like a buzzard waiting on a carcass, he ought at least to have the decency not to dress it up as friendship. Grimes did not trouble either of them again after that. The turn, when it came small, the way most true turns do. Late in September, Clara walked the near fence line with Ezra as she had a dozen mornings before, describing the break in the rail same as always, and this time, before she could finish the sentence, his hand found the exact spot she meant to name, fingers reading the splintered wood like a man reading Braille off his own memory of the place. "There," he said, and there was something in his voice Clara hadn't heard since before the war, not triumph exactly, but the plain, quiet satisfaction of a man doing a thing right with his own 2 hands. "I remember this rail. Split it myself the spring before I left, cheap green wood. I told Pa it wouldn't hold the winter." He knelt, ran his hands along the break, and began, unbidden, to work the mend himself, Clara standing back and saying nothing at all, understanding that her silence in that moment mattered more than any words she might have offered. He did not manage every task so well in the weeks that followed. He misjudged distances, stumbled over tools left carelessly in his path, grew short-tempered on his worst days, and apologized, stiffly, on his better ones. But he came to the fence line each morning without being asked, and Gil Rourke, when he returned from tending his sister, remarked to Clara privately that he hadn't seen young Cole move with that kind of purpose since before the enlistment papers were ever signed. Autumn came on hard and fast, the way it did along the Stillwater Creek bottom, and with it came the trouble that would decide, in the end, more than either of them expected. A dry spell through September had left the hayfields brittle, and the barn packed tight with the season's cutting, and Gil Rourke had gone into town for 3 days to see to his ailing sister, leaving Clara and Ezra alone at the place with only each other and a hired boy who slept in the bunkhouse and was, that particular night, laid up with a fever of his own. Clara woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of the horses screaming. She was out of bed and into her boots before she'd fully understood what her body already knew, and out the door into a yard gone strange and orange. The barn's near end already climbing with flame that the dry hay inside had turned hungry and fast. She ran for the bunkhouse first, found the boy fevered and confused, but able to stumble clear at her shouting, and turned back toward the house to rouse Ezra, only to find him already on the porch, one hand braced hard on the rail, his blind face turned toward the roar and crackle of the fire with an expression Clara would remember the whole rest of her life. "The horses," he said, and before she could stop him, he was down the steps and moving toward the barn with the terrible, reckless speed of a man who has decided, in one single moment, that this is the thing that will prove whether he is still worth anything at all. "Ezra, no." Clara caught his sleeve, hauled against it with everything her whole body had. "You can't see in there, the smoke's worse than the dark, you'll never find the stalls." "I know this barn better blind than most men know it sighted," he shouted back, wrenching free. "And I'll not stand out here useless while my father's horses burn because I'm afraid of my own eyes." And he went into the smoke and the roar, and Clara had one single breath in which to decide whether to let him go alone or go with him, and there had never really been a decision in it at all. She went in behind him with her apron pulled up over her mouth and nose, keeping one hand on the back of his shirt, so she would not lose him in the roiling black smoke that had already swallowed the barn's rafters whole. The heat came at her like a living thing. Somewhere ahead, Ezra's voice, steady despite everything, called the horses by name: Duke, Nell, Old Duchess. The low, certain tone he'd used with them for years, cutting through their panic better than any sighted man's shouting could have. "Left," Clara gasped against the smoke, her hand still fisted in his shirt. The stall doors swung half shut, mind the latch, and between her eyes and his memory, and the horses' own terror driving them toward any voice that offered calm, they got Duke's halter loose and turned him for the door, and then Nell's, the animals half dragging them both toward clean air before bolting free into the yard. It was Duchess, the old mare, spooked and cornered in the farthest stall, who cost them the most. She reared against the smoke, caught Ezra a glancing blow across the shoulder that sent him staggering into a support post, and for one heart-stopping moment Clara lost her grip on his shirt entirely, lost him in a roiling dark that had no up or down left in it, only heat and roar and her own choked screaming of his name. She found him by touch alone, on his knees, one hand pressed to a rafter that groaned above them with the particular sound of old wood about to give way entirely, and she hauled him up with strength she did not know until that moment that she possessed, and half carried, half dragged him the last stumbling yards toward the barn door, Duchess bolting past them into the yard, a bare instant before the loft came down behind them all in a roar of sparks and collapsing timber. They fell together into the cold night grass outside, coughing, Clara's hands shaking as she ran them over Ezra's face and shoulders checking for burns, for blood, for anything the fire might have taken from him besides the little she already knew it had. "I'm whole," he managed between coughs, one hand closing hard over hers where it pressed against his cheek. "Clara, I'm whole. Are you?" "I'm whole," she said, and found she was laughing and crying at once, the way a body will when terror lets go of it all in a single breath, relief and fury tangled together until she could hardly tell one from the other. "You went in there like a fool, Ezra Cole, like an absolute, reckless fool." "I went in there," he said, "because for the first time since I came home, I remembered what it felt like to be a man doing something instead of a man being managed, even if it near killed the both of us doing it. He drew a ragged breath, and his hand tightened over hers, and when he spoke again his voice had none of its old armor left in it at all. You came in after me. You could have stood safe in that yard and let me be the fool alone, and instead you came in after me into a fire, not knowing if you'd come out again. Why, Clara? After everything I've said to you these weeks, telling you to go, telling you I'm no good to you. Because I love you, Clara said simply, the words coming easier now than they ever had in all the weeks of arguing that had come before, because there was nothing left between them now but the plain, scoured truth of it. I loved you blind and I loved you whole, and I'd have loved you however that war saw fit to send you home, Ezra, and I am done, entirely done listening to you tell me otherwise. You can go on being ashamed if you need to. I understand it better than you think. But you'll be ashamed with me standing right here beside you, because I am not leaving this farm. And I am not leaving you, not for fire, not for your pride, not for anything this world has left to throw at us. The barn burned down to its bones behind them, and the yard filled within the hour, with neighbors roused by the glow against the sky. Buckets and shovels and Gil worked himself riding in hard from town at the first word of smoke, having turned back the moment he smelled trouble on the wind. They saved the house. They saved the animals, all but a scorched hen or two. And in the gray light of the following dawn, sitting together on the porch steps with soot still in their hair, and the ruined barn smoking gently in the new day's light, Ezra Cole reached for Clara's hand and did not let it go. I've no barn left, he said, and a farm half mended by a blind man's stubbornness and your patience, and precious little to offer a woman beyond what I've already failed to offer these 3 weeks running. You've offered me everything that matters, Clara said. You offered it the moment you went into that fire instead of standing safe and sorry for yourself in the yard. A man who'll still run toward what needs saving, blind or whole, is a man worth every hard morning I've spent proving it to him. Then marry me, Ezra said, turning his face toward her, unseeing and entirely certain. Not because you're too stubborn to leave, though God knows you are, but because I've finally understood these 3 weeks that I'd rather live a whole life in the dark with you beside me than a lifetime of sight with you gone. Marry me, Clara, and help me build a new barn, and grow old on this land the way my father meant for it, and let me spend however many years I've got left proving I was worth the waiting. I've been waiting to hear you ask that since before you ever left for the war, Clara said, and kissed him there on the porch steps in the smoke-smudged morning light, with the ruined barn behind them and a whole new life, hard one and entirely theirs, spread out ahead. They were married that November in the little Stillwater church, with her mother's lace veil after all, since her father had kept it safe against just such a hope. And Dr. Fenwick stood up as witness and declared, loud enough for the whole congregation to hear, that he'd delivered a great many babies in his years, but never once felt prouder standing at a wedding than he did watching Ezra Cole find his bride's hands without a moment's hesitation, and hold on to them like a man who had finally stopped being afraid of what he could not see. They rebuilt the barn that same autumn, with half the county turning out to raise the frame, and Ezra learned, in the years that followed, to walk his own fields by memory and feel, until the neighbors stopped remarking on his blindness at all, and spoke, instead of what a fine hand he had with horses, and what a fortunate man he was in his wife. Silas Grimes never rode out to Stillwater again. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the new barn stood solid against the darkening sky, Clara would sit beside Ezra on the porch he had built with his own careful, memorized hands, and think that she had never once, in all the hard weeks of that terrible homecoming, considered doing anything but what she had done, which was simply to stay, and keep staying, until the man she loved remembered how to believe he was worth staying for.